So, hello, hi everybody, and good evening. Most of you already know, as Gabriel said, that Embrace Fully creates what we call angel teams of volunteers who help former inmates who found Christian Science inside a prison. Angel teams help find the resources and community that a former inmate needs to successfully navigate back to society. Now, imagine what would happen if those people coming out of prison would have had the opportunity, like most of us did, to grow up in families surrounded by loving parents who guided them along the way, teaching them right from wrong. Um, there would be very few people going to prison because of an abusive background. I was just mentioning this earlier, that for 10 years that I worked with severely disturbed juveniles from the streets and from gangs. They were in cities and towns throughout New England. And, the only thing that they all had in common is that every single kid in our program, anyway, had been abused as children. With trauma like that, our kids became kind of like known as kids without a conscience. And our guest tonight knows something about this, and we are privileged to have Whitney Louchheim with us. And she's an attorney who works with troubled youth. She's the CEO of her own law firm in Washington, D.C. It's called Open City Advocates, and she's a Christian Scientist. I'm interested to see, probably like you are, how she puts all of that together and how our youth in Washington D.C. are helped. So thank you, Whitney, for giving us of your valuable time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Good. Well, let's just start just with telling us a little bit about your background and what was it about the law that attracted you?
Sure. As you said, I've been doing this for about 20 years, started this organization 20 years ago. So going back to then, before law school, I was in disability rights. But I was really attracted to the law before that. I think the main thing that was pulling me to the law was a feeling of just not understanding where all the pulls and levers were, not understanding how change happened, how to succeed in pushing for justice. My mom, both my parents were Christian Scientists, and my mom had focused on Native American art and Native American studies. And as a child, we went around to a lot of different Native American reservations and stayed there. And so I early on had both there and in rural Pennsylvania, just in growing up in rural Pennsylvania, had insights into the disparities that were around me, and mostly poverty that I was seeing, and was struggling as a child and as I was growing up, figuring out how that fit in with my worldview and what my role was. And so the law, as went through my education, seemed to me the best tool that I could get to make the most out of my own skills.
Hmm. Well, actually, what motivated you then to become involved with working with troubled youth?
Sure. Well, when I first was looking at law school, I had two things in mind. One was prison conditions, because I had been, I'd understood what was going on in United States prisons and the problem that we had with mass incarceration and the overuse of prisons. Um, but I also was interested in poverty law, and human rights. Those were the things that where my interests were intersecting. And I heard in my very first month of law school, I heard a juvenile defender talk about her job. And my friend and I, who is my co-founder, were both listening to her. And she had been interested in child soldiering in Africa, where she had had some experience. And both of us were instantly converted. What I heard from her was that I could have a meaningful and long-term holistic client relationship, that I could get involved in the root causes of what was going on, while also using the law to make change. And do that at home. I really wanted to focus on my own community which I had adopted Washington, D.C. by then as my home, and to really focus on D.C. And I was converted from there, and then it evolved after that.
Mm, well, I mean, there's so much in there, and I'm sure it's going to come out. But on your opencityadvocates.org website, it says that you provide youth-centered legal defense and holistic advocacy. Care to explain what those terms might mean?
Sure. Well, the youth-centered part is my favorite part. That means that what we do is client-centered. And what that means is that I don't come to a client relationship with an agenda. I don't decide what the best thing is for my young clients or what they would need to make their lives better. Instead, I know that they are the experts in their lives and in their families, and I listen to what they have to say and what they want, and I fight for that. It's not that I don't give counsel and advice to my clients, of course I do, but at heart, I'm listening to them and empowering them to move their lives in the directions that they want to see it go. Uh, so that's what I mean by youth-centered, as opposed
Do you
to,
help them set goals? Is that one
yes,
with, so that's kind of a
exactly.
key to what it is that you're talking about.
Exactly, because we don't know how to advocate if we don't know what their goals are. So sometimes they don't know exactly what their goals are, and so
Yeah.
it's having that conversation over a long time, because certainly we have to build trust first, and that happens over the course of months to build a
Mm,
trusting relationship and show them that we're not going to abandon them, that we're not going to break promises. They have been abandoned and hurt by a lot of adults in their lives. And so we have
mm,
to prove that we are going to be trustworthy and worthy of their time and confidence.
mm,
So after we get there, then we can start building goals and they can start confiding in us and what they want. So
right.
let's see, that was the youth-centered. Legal
Yeah, what's the
advocacy.
holistic advocacy? That one I want to hear.
Okay, like you know what the legal advocacy is. The holistic advocacy means that nothing is too big or too small for the scope of what we do for our youth. So if for example, what is bothering them is they can't get to school because they don't feel safe on the bus or the metro and they need help getting to school, then we help them get to school. If it's that they really want to learn karate, then we help them learn karate. If it's they're really worried about their little brother not having enough to eat, then we help them solve that and work with the family to solve that. It's really that there's that from their point of view, their life is one whole. It's not just legal problems.
Yeah.
And so while the legal problems are what we're best at solving, we can do that through a wide lens to see, okay, here's how we solve these other problems and help them solve all of them if to the extent that we can.
Well, this is kind of different than most law firms. I
Yes,
mean, you guys are diving right into somebody's life.
that's right.
And
And for a long time, our average client relationship is 6 years. So it's a long time.
wow. Well, that's amazing. I'm so glad we're talking. Your website says that you were founded to address racial inequalities in the DC juvenile justice system. And what were the specific racial issues and inequalities that jumped out at you that needed to be combated?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple different things.
Because that's a
First,
big one to me.
it is
That's
the big one. It is the big one. It is the main reason for our existence. Um, First, I was clerking for a judge in the abuse and neglect system during law school, and I got to see a lot of the backgrounds of the families, and many of the families in the abuse and neglect system were also in the delinquency system. It's kind of the same families. Um, and I could see the generational trauma that was going through the families. And I also saw that although DC is not 100% Black, the system involved families were 100% Black. The poverty, DC is a strange place in that the poverty disparity and income disparity line is the same.
mm,
So in DC, we don't have poor white families or low income. The only low income families for the most part in DC are Black families, and then for the most part, the only wealthy people are white. So it's really a very stark and segregated place to live.
Mm.
And it really throws into contrast racial inequities and disparities. But in the system, when I had just learned while I was in law school that the DC courts are located on the same property where DC's slave market had been. And
Oh.
I just read this, and then I was sitting in court with my judge, and she was on a rotation where she was hearing arrest warrants. Essentially, they're called custody orders. When kids have an arrest warrant out, say they run away from home or they run away from their placement, they get something called a custody order, which is essentially an arrest warrant for a child. And then they're brought into court. And I was sitting there observing, and a 13-year-old boy came in. And like all of the children in the system, he also is Black. And he was very small, very frightened. And he was shackled with handcuffs, belly chains, ankle chains. And he shuffled through the courtroom, barely able to hold up the weight of all these chains on him. He's tiny. He was, smaller than me. It was absurd, to say the least, that he was shackled and chained like this. And this is just standard practice. And he was alone. He was wearing the clothes from the night before, and he was terrified. No one was there for him. No one seemed to know where he was. It was me and the judge and the stand-in attorney who he had never met, who was there. And at that moment, I thought, thinking about the history, the through line that I was seeing very clearly historically in front of me, I thought, okay, I have to be there. I have to be standing next to that child. That has to be where I am. We can't let children be alone in this horrendous, scary system. So that was one moment. And then another moment was my friend had been introduced. She had taken a tour of the long-term juvenile detention center in DC, which has since been closed for poor conditions. But at the time, we went there, and in this place, it was such bad conditions that you couldn't quite believe it. The children are kept in disgusting rat-infested cold or hot cells. They're never comfortable, with holes and not enough blankets and metal toilets. The staff would instigate fights and watch them fight, and sometimes forcing them to fight each other. It was really a terrible place. They had a whole wing of 10 and 11-year-olds who were being held there, some of whom hadn't committed any crimes, but just kept running away from home. And so they put them there. And they were so young, they had to be in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. So when we came in there, they are peering out of their cells in their scratched up glass windows, barely tall enough to see out of the windows to see who was coming onto the unit. And in this place, although in DC right now, 52% of DC's youth are Black, 100% of the youth, with an occasional 3% Latino, but 97% will say, of the youth who are incarcerated are Black. And in this facility where I went, and it's still true today, there hadn't been a white child there since 1982. And that's still true.
Oh my gosh.
So it's pretty hard to ignore the racial inequities and disparities that are pretty in your face when you come into the system and see what's going on, and see how they're treated. They're treated often by the system as animals, as not children. They're sometimes, they're treated as though they were adults, as though they should be behaving like adults and making decisions like adults when they're not. They're just children. So that's a long answer. You have a lot of questions, so I'll stop there, but there you get the flavor.
Yeah. I can't wait to learn a little bit more about how it is you have addressed those issues. But I'm kind of curious to know, or eager to know, just how do you make the juvenile justice system compassionate? Any examples of how you might soften like a judge's heart who is also getting emotional input from the victim?
Yes, that's a lot of what we do actually, is humanize our clients. And so in front of the judges, the way that we do that, 'cause the only time we're in front of the judges, well, that's not true. We're not often in front of judges, but when we are, we often are in the position of writing letters because our clients have gotten in trouble again. And so what we do is we write mitigation sentencing letters that talk about who this person is and the background, showing that they too have been the victim of violence and abuse, have known many people who have died, have had their own family members killed in front of them, that kind of thing. So we talk about that trauma, and we also talk about what it means to be that age, whether it's 13, 16, even 22. We talk about brain development, and I know this is odd for a Christian Scientist to be talking about, but I've gotten very used to it. We talk about, how long a child is a child. When can they make decisions like an adult, and when can they be expected to make decisions like an adult? And it's not really till 25. So we talk about that also. And then we talk about all the good things. We talk about how they like sports and how they advocate for themselves. And we give specific stories of what they've done to make the judge, in the case, if it's the judge, see them as a human being and not just as a name, not just as a case, or as you say, not just as a perpetrator, because they are hearing from victims, but as a victim themselves and as someone who deserves individualized responses and trauma appropriate, responses that recognize the trauma that they too have experienced.
Yeah.
And that's just judges. I mean, we also do that with the DC Juvenile Agency, oftentimes saying, trying to get them to respond to our clients in more understanding and individualized ways, and not just cookie cutter ways to say, oh, well, everyone has to get this ankle bracelet on. We try to push back on that and say, well, she doesn't need it. She hasn't had the same problems that you're saying that she does, just really trying to individualize each client as much as possible.
And they listen? You've got a
Yes.
process there, and you're asking the sort of like, can you just not do the process?
Yes, we do. We have, it's hard to measure exactly when you're preventing something from happening. But we have prevented many, many years of incarceration this way, by helping judges see who they are and correcting incorrect statements, sometimes just lies about our clients. Sometimes it's not just perspective, but actual lies about our clients. So yes, we are preventing a lot of incarceration.
Well, thank you for your work. What steps do you guys take to help a child reintegrate back to their families? Can you give an example of some of the challenges that you face in working with families, especially parents? And is there any successes there?
Yeah, sure. Families come in all different shapes and sizes. So we've had clients with very supportive, active parents who are ready to accept and support their child. And we've also had the opposite end of the spectrum, parents who are so bogged down with their own issues, whether it's drug addictions or mental health, usually both, homelessness and chronic poverty, abuse in their own relationships, that they can't really support our clients. It's never that they don't want to. We've never had a parent who didn't love their child. We've never seen a parent who didn't want to support their child. What we've seen is parents who just can't, because there's too much going on with their lives. So in those situations, it depends, of course, on the situation, but if the child is very young, then we work on finding an alternative placement. If it's maybe a different family member they could stay with, or if there's really no one, then working on a foster home placement for them as a possibility. And then if they're old enough, working on independent living, whether they can get their own place. And sometimes having a stable, independent place to live helps them heal those family relationships, because they get a little distance and they're not dependent on their parents in the same way. So the healing can happen a little more naturally sometimes that way. But sometimes the families are ready and it's just logistical barriers. So for example, we recently had a young man whose father, who's a single father, was ready to take him back from incarceration. But in the last 2 months of the child's incarceration, the father became homeless. And so then he couldn't be released, to his father. And so what we did is we worked with the dad to get him a housing case manager. He was able to get housing relatively quickly. And then we also had funds of our own that we could use to help him furnish his apartment because he didn't have a bed for our client. So we were able to purchase the bed and the mattress and that sort of thing to outfit the bedroom, dresser and that sort of thing. And so he was able to be released on time and live with his dad. And that's been more than a year now, and everything's fine. Living with his dad and going to school, and his dad's working. So that's been great. But it could have been an insurmountable barrier. It could have been he had to be removed from his family, but it was really actually just relatively
Yeah,
small things that needed to be solved.
yeah. Sounds like you guys have to have a team. I mean, this isn't like a couple of people doing stuff. This sounds like you have to have a team and you have to have the funding in case something like, oh my gosh, you need housing. Where's the
Definitely.
funding going to come from?
Definitely. We have been really focused on the financial part of it. So I mean, can't really be understated how much money can actually solve things. I mean, people maybe joke about how money doesn't solve things, but it does solve a lot of things. So we've been working on helping infuse financial support into our families and youth. One of the things we've been doing that I'm really proud of is been paying our youth to go to school or to workforce development programs so that they don't drop out because they really want to support their families. They need to support themselves and their families and their siblings. And they often make the choice to drop out instead of continuing school so that they can do that. So we've been doing that now for 3 years where we're paying them $18 an hour to go to school. And it's really made a huge difference in their excitement to get the best attendance award, which we've never had before. And now we have from our clients. So that's something. And then we also have other things. Like I said, the furniture, we provide cell phones for our clients and cell phone service, provide laptops if they need it, clothing, food, transportation, all of that, because we don't need those to be barriers to
Yeah,
success.
yeah. So where do you guys normally get involved, in the process with a kid?
We are unusual in that we start after sentencing. So
Okay.
the reason besides the racial inequity, that was one piece, but the other reason for our existence is that in DC and across the country, after sentencing in the juvenile system, kids are sentenced to years of supervision under the agency or court or government, and can be placed in all different places. But the right to counsel was not so clear. In many cases, there was no and is no right to counsel. So we were filling that gap. And then we've recently, in 2020, won a case here in DC Court of Appeals recognizing the right to counsel during this period. Um, so we get involved at sentencing. Usually it's through the court that appoints us. Sometimes we're referred by families or youth themselves, or other organizations, but that's typically the point when we get involved.
Mm. Sentencing, I'm just wondering how much sway you have over that.
None, because we're after. We come in after.
But you don't have any contact with a judge, for example, ahead of time, and I mean, so
No,
that they know more about the case.
only after. So we help train attorneys so that they can do a good job at sentencing. And tell the judges about who the kid is. But no, our specific niche is after sentencing. Now in DC,
Okay.
after sentencing, the judges have very little left they can do.
Okay.
It's mostly the juvenile agency that has all the power. The juvenile agency decides whether to lock them up, how long to lock them up, whether to place them in a group home or send them out of state or let them stay at home. It's usually all of the above over the course of years. So
Mm,
those are our main audience.
mm. Well, so this is a tough one, I would think, that is how do you support a child who really wants a family but has a broken family where the parents are pretty much dysfunctional? Is it possible to bring those families together?
It is possible. It really depends on the situation. In some cases, it's helping the family connect to the supports they need. So, we had a client recently whose mom was in and out of jail and suffering from pretty severe mental health and substance use issues. And the best way that we knew that we could help really him and his relationship with his mom was to help her connect to supports. Now, we can't support her. That's first of all not what we do, but also that would be a bit of a conflict, but we could connect her to other supports. So we were working with various agencies to try to wrap around her to get her stable, so that he could go home. So that's the kind of thing we could do. But then it's sometimes it's other situations, like I said before, where really helping the child become more independent um, helps relieve some of that tension so that the family can work on themselves and the child can work on himself and they can come back together without that tension of lack of support.
Hmm. Well, how do you make a kid more independent?
Well, it depends on their age, really, but it's a lot of teaching skills. So,
They're already pretty independent. I mean, it sounds like how do you rein that in? How do
I
you
mean,
put,
sometimes it's just helping them understand how the world works. I mean, we had a client once who thought that the way that you got an apartment is you paid rent once and it was your apartment for the rest of your life. He just didn't understand, and this is very childlike thinking, these are children, right? They
like,
just don't understand. So sometimes it's just helping them understand, well, what is it to have an apartment and how do you make payments? What is it to have a
hmm,
bank account and why is that safe? Um,
hmm,
just some really simple things, like what it means to have a job, what it means to to go on time and to have a boss, and it doesn't, what are the downsides of having a boss, the upsides of having a boss, just sort of really talking through
hmm,
how they can think about that, and what a budget is. Now these are very long-term conversations. We're not going to turn a 16-year-old into a 32-year-old, by some conversations, but it's
yeah,
just getting them prepared to start thinking about it.
yeah. Can I ask who's on your team that that you guys are meeting and who's doing what? I mean, it sounds like you're going to have a like a baseball team. You're going to need all kinds of positions to be filled.
Well, we really rely on our community partners a lot. So we have, besides me and our co-founder, we have three other attorneys on staff.
Mhm.
And then we have a communications person and an operations person. Um, and well, communications and development. Um, so one of our attorneys does have her master's in social work. She's new. We just hired her in August. A lot of what we do is make it our business to know who is out there providing support that we don't need
Yes.
to duplicate, but that we can lean on and
Yeah.
partner with.
Yeah.
So if they need education help, we have an organization that is of education attorneys, and they can help identify the right school placement. So make sure that all of my clients have disabilities, every single one. And all of them are in special education. Well, I shouldn't say all, like maybe 90% are in special education. So, making sure that their special education needs are being met by the school, that they're in a school that can meet them, making sure their transcripts are ready. That's the kind of thing that an education attorney can do. So we connect them with that. That's just an example of
Mhm.
partnership that we have.
Mhm. So, what improvements need to be made in the juvenile justice system? What are some of the biggest legal hurdles that you face that need to be addressed?
That was I saw that question and it was really a tough one because a lot of me often wants to just throw it all away and start over, but that's not going to happen.
Well, if you were
Um,
to start over, what would happen? I mean, start there
well,
for a moment. What would be ideal? What would be the ideal system?
ideal would be that all of these needs would have been met before they got to be teenagers. Um, they
Hmm.
wouldn't have experienced that abuse, and we would have had the families wrapped around with support so that the parents didn't weren't facing such a crisis while the kids were growing up. Um, but barring that, if we have a system, I think we need to dramatically reduce our reliance on incarceration. Incarceration of children is something I think we will look back on in future generations and shake our heads and think, how did they do that? How would they do that? Why would they put children in cages? Um, it's not only cruel, but
Mm.
it's dangerous for the children. The children are getting assaulted and abused, physically abused, sexually abused, watching other people be abused. They're being taken away from their families. They can't communicate with their families. They're scared. They're not getting educated. I mean, it's really all the things you would never want a child to experience is what they experience.
You know what we
Um,
found is that kids started to normalize that.
that's
The
true
kids, the
because they
kids
have
that
to
we
cope.
worked with, and
Yeah,
they just, and we, yeah, we'd find that they had no problem going back to prison, or no problem. These are kids, no problem going back to, detention.
yeah. And
Seemed normal, seemed
that's
normal.
right. That's because I mean, they cope, right? They're amazingly resilient. Whatever their normal is, that's how they learn to navigate and they figure out how
Yeah,
to navigate that,
yeah.
and how to survive in that. Um, but I really do think that if we did a better job of community supports, it would be not only better for the children and better for public safety, it would also be tremendously cheaper. Because I do think that if we had, say, therapy and counseling going into the home every single day, and someone taking the children to school and making sure there's food in the fridge and making sure the
Yeah.
parents have support they need, all of that would cost a fraction of what it costs to incarcerate a child. Um, but we don't do it, and it's something that's deeply frustrating to me, but we're working on.
What are you guys doing to maybe at some point tackle that?
Well, our systemic advocacy. So the other half of what we do client work, is also systemic work. So we take what we learn from our clients and push for systemic reform efforts. We are in a coalition of a variety of different youth advocacy groups, and we push for policy reform. We testify. I've testified more this year in front of DC Council than I have in my entire career. Um, we push for legislation. We help with impact litigation, all the things we can do. We try to pull all the levers, honestly, to get things changed.
Okay, so how does spirituality come into play
Mm.
in your work?
To me, it
Let
is
me just ask this. What legal issues do you see on a pretty regular basis? And what's your process for praying to resolve those issues?
okay.
Big question.
Yes. So for the legal issues and the legal strategies, the spirituality is, I mean, it's always internal, right? It's always something I'm working on with myself and my relationship with God. But in that particular example of legal work, it's helping me listen and be open and be guided and led to the right answer rather than deciding and outlining what it should be myself. It's really something that's been a wonderful lesson over and over is that um, when God lays out the plan, it's much better than anything I could have come up with. It's beautiful and simple and effective, and I never would have thought of it if I hadn't just been quiet and listened. So that's something that I know my best work is when I'm being led and listening.
Mm.
The most challenging things for me that demands the most healing for me is actually the adults in the world that are working with my clients. They are the ones who are supposed to be doing right, say working in the agency, for example, but who aren't. And
Mm.
that takes a tremendous amount of work on my part to correct what I'm seeing, to not accept what I'm seeing,
Mm.
and to not say, oh, they are just being horrible, or they are unjust, or they are being racist, or they are being unfair, but to
Yeah.
not let myself go there. Or if those thoughts are coming to me, stop and
Mm.
start to heal the situation from my own perspective and really force myself to see them
Mm.
as God sees them. And even if I can't even get there, to know that that picture is out there and I need to get there, even if I can't see it. Um, that's actually the most challenging thing of all for me because that's where, I get angry at what's going on and I have to heal that.
Mm.
And it's not that being angry is necessarily bad, but it's not helpful really in the end. It may be, telling me something's wrong, but then I have to fix it. So that's where the healing work really comes in, is helping me love, and not just love my clients, which is easy, but
Mhm.
love those who seem to be perpetuating the injustices.
Yeah.
And I do think I would have been quite burnt out a long time ago had it not been for Christian Science and allowing me to regain my equipoise every time.
Mm. I'm just wondering when you were talking about being still and being quiet, how valuable that is. Have you, I'm sure you do this, do you work with the kids on those particular topics?
Sometimes it depends on my relationship with the kid and if that's the kind of conversations we've gotten into.
Hmm.
But absolutely I do. And I try to meet them wherever they are and use whatever language makes most sense to them. So for example, I had a Latino client recently who was really digging into his family's tradition in Catholicism and what his understanding of God was. And he was struggling with himself as a sinner and what that meant, and how he could repent and what was his future, what was his relationship with God. And so I was talking with him about my own view of God and my own view of how God sees us, but trying to put it into words that, I was echoing back words that he was using, because it was making sense to him that way. Whereas someone else who maybe isn't coming from the same kind of tradition or isn't using that kind of language, I change the way I talk about it to a language that just makes more sense to them. So it really is. It's if our conversations get to that kind of thing, I talk about how I handle issues, and say, well, this is what I've done in those kinds of situations and how I see it. Or if I'm struggling with myself, this is what I've done. Um, and just open up the conversation, and make it a safe space for them to talk about it if they want, and that they know that that's a resource that I bring to the table.
Have you seen, and I'm sure you have, moral transformation of character in kids just through your work?
Yes, and the what I see it as sort of so quintessentially Christian Science, in that the children are always and always have been pure and innocent, and it's letting it shine through. It's
Mm.
seeing it and watching it shine through. It's not that they're starting as immoral and becoming moral. It's that I'm seeing them for who they are. And because I'm seeing it, everyone else starts to see it and they start to see it in themselves too.
Mm.
So it's a lovely parallel to Christian Science in that way, is that we're also helping other people see that this child has always been a child, and has always been doing everything they can to thrive in their own world. Um,
Mm.
but there was one particular client who, um, when we were considering taking him, a number of different people warned us against it and said that he was a psychopath and that we should be careful. It's
Mhm.
dangerous. Um, and I was, well, first of all, fairly appalled that they were describing him that way. I hadn't met him yet, but it didn't seem like appropriate words. But I, in any case, prepared myself to go into the interview and just love. And that's how I knew I was going to do, is
Mhm.
just be totally open and totally loving and just make sure that he felt that from me.
Mm.
And he came into the interview, um, and I could see from his facial expression what he was expecting from me. And he had wide eyes and looked angry. And what he was expecting from me very clearly was judgment and fear.
Mm.
And I gave him none of that, but instead was just open and telling him who we were and how we worked and how, if he decided to join our program, what it would be like and what we would offer, and asked him about, what his interests were. Um, and as throughout the interview, the bracing of himself to be prepared to meet my judgment began to fade, and he began to be more quizzical as he just didn't believe anything I was saying. So at first he was, just oppositional, but then just thought I was nuts and wasn't saying anything that made any sense.
Did he think you were setting him up? Is that you think?
Yeah, he certainly thought what I was saying was a bunch of lies.
Oh.
But also just nonsensical.
Hmm.
Nothing that he had seen before or was willing, it takes a certain amount of vulnerability to join something, to say, okay, yeah, I want to be part of this, or I want to tell you about myself. And he was very defensive, he was protecting himself because he had been hurt many, many, many times. And then we said, okay, we're going to be back in 3 days. And we asked him if we could bring him anything specific, and he said what he wanted. So we said, okay, we'll bring that. And we did. We came back in 3 days. We brought what he said he wanted. And he was amazed that we came back. He's like, you're back. I said, we said we'd be back. He's like, I know, but nobody comes back. And then we kept coming back week after week after week. And he's now one of my closest clients. That anger that we saw in his eyes never came back after that first interview. Because I didn't know him before I knew him, I don't know why people were telling me he was a psychopath. But like we see in Christian Science, it doesn't matter. It disappeared. And that was gone. That's no longer part of who he was, and it's no longer what anyone would ever say about him. He graduated from high school with, I don't know, 7 different awards. He's now an electrician. He's doing really great. So it's Christian Science is a great teaching tool of how something can actually dissolve, something that seems to be the way things are, someone's history, their human history, can actually dissolve into nothing.
You know what I really love about what you just said? It wasn't a bunch of words you said. You said you went in for him so he could feel a sense of love.
Yeah.
And I think that is so valuable in our work with people, that's what they feel first. The only thing I remember about Sunday school, sounds weird, one teacher in my whole experience, and I'm not saying they were all bad or anything like that. I'm just saying I felt the love of one teacher. It was almost like it saturated all the kids in the class. Literally felt like whatever nonsense we were thinking about, we stopped thinking about it. But I love that what you were doing. We're gonna
people
open
respond
this
to
up.
love.
Yeah. That's kind of cool. I mean, he didn't have any defense against that, So why don't we open up to our group that's here that probably has questions, and Gabriel, are you able to orchestrate this part?
Yeah, let's go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, what about the unrepresented kids, like the first 13-year-old that inspired you? And for those kids, why do you only step in after sentencing?
Yes. Well, that's where the biggest need is. It's a great question, but we don't quite leave it there. So our systemic work works on all the other things too. So we are working to get enough attorneys and well-trained attorneys and specialized attorneys in all the different areas. So at the point of arrest and through trial, we don't typically have a shortage of attorneys. There's typically enough. Because that child was post-sentencing, that's where the big hole was, that after sentencing, they were abandoned completely by the legal system, by their attorneys. So that's where we picked up the slack. But we aren't just doing it ourselves. We've set up a panel of attorneys to take on the kids who we can't take. And we've pushed the public defender service to do more, which they have. And then we've also begun publishing and training jurisdictions around the country because we've recognized that this issue is not unique to DC. So this year we put out a publication to help other states do the same thing. And we've started training attorneys around the country to help, because we are not the lone jurisdiction with this problem. I don't know if I answered your question though, Rachel.
Yeah, I think so. You work with lawyers to make sure, as to the best of your ability, that all children can be represented.
That's right.
And I bet that Just Mercy is one of your favorite movies.
Yes. I would love to get Brian Stevenson as a speaker. We
Mm.
tried. He wasn't available for 2025, but we'll keep trying.
Let's go to Eleanor.
Thank you. This is really fascinating, the work that you do. I love the fact that you speak to them on their own level and try not to use jargon, but speak to them in terms they can understand, and that you speak from the standpoint of your own experience. I'm wondering are you the only Christian Scientist in your firm?
Yes.
And do they get your approach, and do they share your sense of how to approach them on with love and trust and consistency?
Yes, my co-founder and very close friend is a Buddhist. And so this is a Christian Science Buddhist partnership. And
Mhm.
we are very careful about how we train our attorneys. And we started actually as a mentoring program. Before we won the right to counsel, we had to get in the door as mentors. And so mentoring and lawyering to us are one and the same when you're in the juvenile system, that you have to develop that relationship of trust and exude that love. So it's something we put into our training manual. We put it into our training, with our new attorneys. We supervise with it. We also, of course, treat our staff that way too, and try to demonstrate it with them and work on their own self-care and make sure they're taking care of themselves and they feel loved themselves, so that they can then turn around and give that love back.
Is your training manual available? Sounds like a wonderful thing to read.
No, it's not actually. I'll think about that, how we could do that.
It doesn't have to be available to the public, just to select friends, right?
That's true. Yes, that's true. I do have some of it that I could share.
Kelly, I see your hand is up.
Hi. I have a question for you, maybe like a couple. So I've been listening where I can listen because it's kind of noisy where I'm at. But I understand what you guys do, but I also understand that Fully Embrace has a team that actually helps the incarcerated adults, correct? And I wanted to know, well, I don't know, I'm just going to put this out there. So who can I speak to about an issue that's going on in the prisons now with the guys that are being held up by the Supreme Court who were granted parole? A lot of them had signed up under Prop 57 to go to programs or take an educational course through the college that comes to teach the guys. In exchange of that, based off of their good behavior in completing these programs, they were able to get their parole advance. It was like an incentive for them to complete these things. Once they completed them, come to find out, CDCR never had the authority to authorize this for some of the inmates that are there. So now there's 26,000 inmates that have been granted parole that are not allowed to leave. Is there anyone that's familiar with it or can offer some insight on how to go about? I don't know, because I just feel like there needs to be some type of awareness. The only reason why I know is because my husband's going through this. He's completed these things, and I've gotten.
You're in California, right?
Unfortunately.
All right, write this down. This is the law firm you want to talk to there in Oakland, called Root and Rebound.
Got it.
Okay. They know this issue intimately, so give them a call.
Okay, I'll give them a call in the morning. Thank you.
Okay.
good. That's a good question, Kelly. And just to kind of be clear, Embracefully, we are not necessarily a legal law firm ourselves, so we're not doing kind of some of the same work that Whitney is doing directly. We are primarily focused on helping welcome people home once they actually do walk out of those doors. So certainly you could be in touch with us, Kelly, when your husband does get out, if that is of interest to you.
Yes, he filled out an application several times, but
Okay.
when it came down to it, I don't know where the ball got dropped, but the ball was dropped, but it's okay. It's okay. We have time to start the process over, obviously, because he's not coming home tomorrow.
Yeah, and I'll say that we've been continually like just evaluating how we are interacting with people on the inside and kind of what that timeline can look like, as well as matching up angel teams to people who are kind of within that year or so of release. Also, Kelly, you might get in touch with Chris Hoke and Underground Ministries just to see if they might have any of their groups in the area.
They're not in California yet,
They're not yet? Okay.
not yet.
All right. Awesome. Any other questions for Whitney tonight? Yeah, Carlos.
Hello. I kind of agree with well, I do agree with what the speakers said before about the children being not fully represented in the jails. Because as a chaplain in the county jail, I can see a lot of Latino young people in their 20s or late teens, and they are locked up for minor things like not showing up to the court, but they're homeless and they have no address to be notified to. They have no telephone to be notified to. But they get picked up by the sheriffs or the local police, and they sent to the county jail. And from there, and after about a month, they bring it to the front of the judge. And I think that's very, very wrong. And I agree also with it'd be cheaper to support those children before they get to the prisons. However, my belief is that putting people in prison and jails keep a lot of people employed. It's a business, okay? And being a business, you try to keep as many headcounts that you can, okay? Because the more headcounts, the more money, and that is no, that is my belief for what I see. But it doesn't mean I'm correct on it. But I think the prison system in the United States is a big, big business, and that is why they have to keep people incarcerated. And it doesn't matter if they're children or adults. The more people you have, the more money you get. So that money would be invested in the schools and things like that. I think we would have less people in there. And I'm really grateful for the job that's being done through the speaker's firm in there and helping these children. Thank you very much.
The union of the workers who work in the juvenile prisons are actually some of our biggest opponents in trying to shrink them.
I believe that.
I mean, it's kind of there is this interesting thing. We have talked about this a few times over the past few years, that dichotomy of the people who are employed in this system, and we hope that most of them have a good heart and are well motivated, and obviously there are some that are not acting in what we might call a very Christian way or a very kind way, and are probably just trying to get through it as best they can and also not lose their job. So I think in an ideal world, we get rid of crime and we heal the lingering effects of criminal behavior in society as well, so that we can kind of move forward. Let's go with Deb and then Janine, and then I think Pam, I saw your hand up also a little earlier.
Thank you very much, Whitney. My question is, how are you funded?
Through a diversity of means. We are about 40% government grants of various sorts, and then another 40 to 50% private foundations, and then the other 10% are individual and corporate donations. And in the government grants, we also try to diversify even within those and the foundations too, so that if we lose one, it's not a big deal. So we have maybe 13 to 15 different foundations, and then usually two different government grants we're working with.
Wow.
And is this work solely what you're working on? I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I should say we do get paid by the court a little bit to do this work, but it's a pretty low rate, so there is that too.
Nice. Good question, Deb. Janine, let's go to you.
Oh, first I want to say thank you, Whitney, for what you're doing. And I also just the fellow that you described, that you saw so many changes in him. I feel like I've worked in the prisons as a chaplain in men's prisons for a number of years, and when you see the character change come out, it's almost like, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful to see. But I do see that the youth tend to, I mean, any sense of kindness that you show toward them, in the few times that I was able to go into juvenile hall here, they respond so beautifully to it. And it always makes me, and I know I've mentioned this quote before of Mrs. Zeddy's, but I absolutely love it. She says that sincerity is greater than genius or talent.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the first ones to pick up on whether or not you're sincere.
Absolutely, they can see right through you.
Oh yeah, and so I love that you're doing this, and you're really you put yourself out there when you do this kind of thing.
Thanks.
But it's I mean, it's holy work, really, when it comes right down to it.
Yeah.
So I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. And you're right, that love meets love. It brings it out.
Let's go to Pam.
Yes, I just want to say thank you for taking care of the children and for being a light for them and the warmth, because that's just, it's the foundation. That's the start. I mean, you give them that right at the beginning so they have a sense of hope.
Thank you. It's the joy of my life.
Let's see, do we have other questions? Rachel, is your hand raised again?
Yeah, I wondered about you said there's a whole wing of children that haven't necessarily committed crimes, but just run away from home.
There isn't anymore, but there was.
Oh, good. So does that mean that that whole wing of people they've been relocated into homes, like a group home where they can interact with society? Or
yeah, well, the law has changed. The law
Okay.
has changed so that they're not allowed to incarcerate children under those circumstances anymore. And that, I mean, it does happen still that sometimes runaways get held for maybe a night, but you're right, they go to group homes quickly, they go back home. If it's just a runaway situation, that's no longer an incarceration response, because that's illegal now, thankfully.
I have another question. So, is Troy's organization in DC, the Urban Alchemy?
I don't think so. I haven't heard of it.
Troy Span was featured as an interview, and he was a former inmate, and then his organization meets the people, the homeless that houseless, living on the streets, and helps meet their needs and address their needs, before the people on the street are justice involved.
I'll have to look it up. It sounds awesome.
Did I get the name right? Urban Alchemy?
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, they're former inmates, formerly incarcerated, that are just literally every day going out to meet the houseless, and the police actually rely on them to help mediate conflicts.
Yes, we do have the violence interrupters here, and I love those programs.
Yeah. Thank you so much for what you do, Whitney. You're a
Oh,
huge
thank you.
inspiration.
Thank you all for having me.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions or comments for Whitney before we wrap up for tonight? I wanted to say maybe I've got a question for you, Whitney, and I think David kind of touched on this a little bit. Do you see any like particularly key leverage points in the experience that the people that you're working with are going through, like where you could say like this thing really made a difference to their journey to either become maybe more of a adult seasoned criminal, or saying, yeah, I'm out of that path completely now, and I'm sort of rejoining kind of back to what we would hope society would, have to offer that would be good. Eh, yeah, go ahead.
One is social capital. And that's something we try to bring to them, because a lot of people who are coming from more privileged backgrounds, because like David said in the beginning, or maybe you said it, Gabriel, have the networks and families already around them with the solutions and help and ideas and supports if they run into a crisis. And a lot of our youth don't have that. They don't have people to turn to just for simple problems, but what sometimes is a simple problem is a crisis to them in that moment. And so just having someone they can always turn to and who they trust to say, what do I do in this situation? Has, I think, made a big difference in helping them not panic and not give into fear, and not make bad, quick decisions because of the stress, and their own history of trauma tends to, if they don't have that, tends to drive them to make a bad decision. So that's just one example of how social capital is helpful, but it's also called networking and all of that sort of thing. But to me, that sort of crisis, having a support in crisis makes a big difference. And then I think, just as I said before, some of the financial support we're already seeing makes such a difference in just really keeping crisis at bay. It doesn't take that much money to keep crisis at bay. And I mean crisis like not having a place to live, or not having a mattress, or not having enough food, or, not being able to get to the job interview so that you can get to the job, is really solves a lot of that. So I think both social capital and real capital, some financial capital, helps a lot.
Well, I wanted to say thank you so much for staying up late. I'm sure it's past your bedtime there on the East Coast. We really, really appreciate hearing the good that you're doing there, and we are very much looking forward to bringing our conference this year to First Church of Christ Scientists in Washington D.C. in May. And thank you so much for helping support that, and being a host for us. We really, really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to continuing kind of the discussion around what's going on both locally and regionally in Washington, D.C., as well as the East Coast, and how that fits into the bigger picture. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for your very kind words. And yes, First Church, I'm on the board actually there. We are very excited to welcome you in May. So I hope to see you then.
Awesome. Any last words, David, or?
I just want to say thank you, Whitney. I'm very insightful. Just so wonderful to hear a law firm that's actually more than a law firm.
We're
Far
happy to be
more,
that.
far more
Thank
than a
you.
law firm. You're really a model, I think, for what law firms could be.
Thank you. I very much appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you,
Bye.
Good night,
Whitney.
everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks at our next Angel Team meeting if you're able to make it. And if not, happy Christmas and Happy New Year. Okay,
Same
bye.
to you.